What is the best class? What is the best build? These questions are echoed in nearly every MMO by both new and old players alike. This is the essence of what humankind on Earth has been driven towards. The idea of streamlining the process of living to the point to make things easier and more effective is a very natural, instinctual human element. What's the best way to cook, the best way to survive, and the best way to live? Through the use of developing social hierarchies and powerful tools, humans were able to become the top of the food chain on Earth. The meta in video games very much represents this aspect of human nature. Humans are driven towards a hierarchy and enjoy to classify things as it helps the overall collective intelligence of the species. Basically, we learn more effectively in groups when we pull our resources together, and it's more effective to understand things when we can classify them in the simplest way. This allows us to teach the newer generation more effectively, or at least theoretically, which then continues to push the ceiling of play. The meta in general can elicit groans in any offline or online RPG community, whether it be because you have had that annoying party member who seemingly knows the entire encounter before it begins or it's even played or they expect you to, or someone has beat you over the head in game because you didn't play the meta spec. It's very likely that you have had a negative experience concerning the concept of meta. Stemming from the Greek word of meta, which means after or before, meta in video games simply refers to the hierarchical structure based on the potential of a given build, class, or playstyle, often in the place of a tier list created by and tested by players. The concept itself spans to many different genres within gaming, but arguably none more so than the MMORPG genre, a genre built on creating and using unique builds, playstyles, and abilities, and creating your own unique character. After all, MMORPGs are easily one of the most hardcore/time-intensive genres out there. I mean, things such as metagaming and min-maxing are other concepts born out of pen and paper RPGs that found themselves in MMORPGs as well. I mean, they are the pioneer of the genre after all. These are two concepts that we will cover more in future videos. Why is the meta in an MMORPG so prevalent though? Well, that stems from the genre's very strong roots in old pen and paper RPGs, inevitably based on circumstances such as monster type, armor type, damage type, and chance to hit. Certain weapons or playstyles excel in specific situations. For example, it might be hard to play a fire mage inside of a small room without burning everything inside of it, but an up-and-close bruiser will be maybe much preferred. Effectively, this is how players create a tier list, or the meta. The meta is important because it allows players and developers to track the effectiveness of a playstyle or a build, aka the balance or the meta, and correct where they can and when necessary. The issue is that just because one is preferred in one scenario doesn't mean that you are always able to get to that given situation or scenario. If you're forced to leave that house, for example, well then the fire mage becomes kind of more viable again, correct? Practically speaking, this means that the build that works in arena PvP might not work to the same effectiveness in open world PvP or even a battleground. A leveling spec might be dominant, for example, but perform poorly when placed in a group dungeon. The meta is fluid depending on multiple variables, especially early on in a game's life cycle. Another issue concerning the meta is that the meta isn't always the same at different skills of play, which creates a strong, varied understanding of it. What build might be strong in the professional level of play or even high elo won't be the same build that excels in lower skill situations just simply because, and this might seem a bit confusing, but the more that you are skilled in a game or at a certain thing, the more difficult it becomes to, well, outskill your opponents. So you need better tricks, more practice, and more setups. But if low-level players don't play this same way, well then the most straightforward approach is probably better. The largest issue concerning the meta though is the title of this video. It's actually the meta's greatest strength, while at the same time serving as its greatest weakness. A double-edged sword. Remember the collective intelligence thing I mentioned? It doesn't take you to be burned by a stove to know that the stove is hot because, well, somebody a long time ago got burned by that same stove. You can learn from other people and you can learn from history. This concept works the same way in an MMO. Sometimes you can tell a certain build spec or playstyle excels in a certain place, right? They never use it in a way to bludgeon you to follow the law, right? Sarcasm aside, you can see the issue here. Maybe the person who helped form the meta describes it that way, but maybe the 10th person as this information has passed to only contains a fraction of the nuance and context. To go back to our fire mage example, perhaps someone tells you not to play a fire mage because, well, it's not very powerful in arena. Meanwhile, they are making the assumption that you prefer to play arena, when perhaps you prefer something else entirely, which could change the meta, right? It depends on what you're trying to accomplish at the end of the day, but having a general idea of how the game works in different combat encounters concerning certain classes and playstyles and working on improving such is very helpful and not ultimately something that you can stop. It's human nature. The problem is when people stop saying the why concerning an opinion on a class in an MMORPG. If you don't explain, as mentioned before, that Fire Mage is still powerful but only in these specific situations, you will actually create an incorrect assumption of the game and therefore an incorrect assumption of the meta. This breeds misinformation, which can hurt player skill concerning certain Flavor of the Month builds. Flavor of the Month, or FOTM, is a key aspect of the meta. It's usually the class for a given month or months at a time that is played the most because at its core, it's the easiest to play effectively. Some players will hop from FOTM to FOTM class, creating drone-like players who are unable to perform well on the strength of their own play and understanding of the game, but instead rely on the strength of the class on a given patch cycle. Misinformation spreading is also used as a way to force or attempt to force players to adhere to certain standards. The player forcing the other player to adhere to doesn't even understand themselves in some cases. It's like the blind leading the blind. This is not necessarily a malicious thing, right? Maybe no one's going out of their way to do this, but generally more so due to poor explanations or just laziness. When it becomes malicious is when other players force meta standards on players they have no control over. For example, if you join an LFG dungeon, it's unreasonable to expect that a player in said dungeon will adhere exactly to a given meta. If you want to play with players who do that and maybe, for example, are more interested in knowing what their DPS numbers are, you have to seek out those kinds of players yourself or play on harder difficulties which will naturally attract these kinds of players. But having standards in play just to play the map out, or the dungeon in this case, is not unreasonable, but going into a scenario where you have no control over someone else's play and have no association with that player, and then expect them to follow the meta, it's when it becomes a frustrating, almost oppressive tool. Creating an elite guild where the meta might be followed to a T in, say for example, a high-level raid like World of Warcraft, that's something altogether different, right? But the expectations there are set from the get-go. That's the difference. Speaking of adhering to the meta, the last most key aspect of the meta that often gets overlooked is, well, breaking the meta. In the case of a raid or an instance dungeon, where generally speaking the variables don't change, a meta is oftentimes very draconic by nature. It doesn't have a lot of give and take, and it can, bar developer intervention, often become quite stagnant. This is a key aspect of a meta. In order for a meta to not become oppressive and stagnant, it must have enough variables and changes happening to create change, whether through variables such as player skill or the ability to break the meta. If the player's skill in a given MMORPG isn't great enough on a mechanical level, the game is more reliant on what build you are playing and how you perform at such, aka kind of math, right? But if there is a meta of top builds forming, there inevitably means that there is a counter meta forming at the same time. When I first play an MMO, for example, I'm very much interested in the meta in the sense that I want to know what everyone is playing. But then I kind of almost immediately throw the meta out the window. I start focusing on finding ways to play against what everyone else is playing in the meta, and this has proven to be quite successful for me. And that's because, well, at the end of the day, kind of like with scientific discovery or scientific studies, the point of the meta is to be constantly evolved. The first months of an MMO are a great example of this, where the meta could shift drastically as the game develops until eventually it starts to settle into some regular place. But all it takes is a single player creating a build or playstyle that can just break the meta, and then the process is repeated. That's the very essence of the meta, not to constrict creativity and create clones with poor understanding or desire for certain classes or playstyles, but instead the meta exists to be broken and then reset, and then broken again, like a phoenix being reborn from its ashes. So next time you read a tier list or pay attention to the meta, look for those builds or opportunities to exploit the fact that somebody is playing something so prevalently. This can actually allow you to play some builds that other players would consider off-meta, because you can still play according to the meta even if you don't play the most popular classes. The fact that you don't play a popular class, aka going against the meta, is extremely helpful. And so the curse of the meta in MMORPGs is more often than not a self-inflicted curse. If you don't want to be held to the same strong meta standard, you need to be selective in who you play with and be honest about your desires in the game that you're playing. If you want to play some wacky zany off-meta build, play with it, but understand that not everyone you play with will share the same enthusiasm for you playing off-meta. Ignore the meta ultimately at your own peril though, because at the end of the day, it's a process proven through time and experience. Why ignore collective intelligence if it can ease your suffering? Why keep allowing yourself to get burned on the stove, right? Thanks for watching, guys.